Okay, our next speaker is come down from Connecticut, Kevin Jobe. He's fisheries biologist with Connecticut Department of Environmental
Energy and
Environmental Protection. But he specializes in a thing that's near and dear to us, and particularly sea tuck. One of our main projects is restoring river herring runs, and Kevin's going to give us a really interesting talk about some of the issues with this species in terms of bringing it back and the importance of looking at the big picture, putting all the pieces of the puzzle together. Okay, thank you, Kevin, for coming down. Now, this advances, the lower one advances. Then you just need to push it. You don't need to direct it at anything.
Wonderful. Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right.
Hey, everybody. How's it going? You're probably wondering why a biologist from Connecticut is over here for a New York conference, but the reality here is we share the same body of water between us, and genetically, the fish river herring that we're going to be talking about today, and specifically, we're sharing alewives here. So I was lucky. Emily Hall had reached out to me after an AFS meeting last year, and I was able to come out here and meet with a diagenous fish working group. I've since gone on to meet with some of the PEP people, gotten some really nice tours of the fishways around this area, and I think it's very fitting that we kind of treat Long Island Sound as this one large place. So thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So jumping right into it here, we're going to be talking about disappearing southern New England river herring, data gaps, and the need to revisit incidental bycatch in the northwestern Atlantic fisheries. And this is specifically, we're talking about Atlantic herring and Atlantic mackerel fisheries. So, for you who are not familiar with river herring, specifically on Long Island, we're really going to be focusing on alewives. But we have alewives and blueback herring. Blueback herring are in the larger river systems, whereas alewives like the natural kettle ponds like we have here on Long Island. And these fish, for those of you who are familiar with Pacific salmon, for instance, these are an anadromous species. So these are fish that spend their adult lives at sea and then move inland to spawn in fresh water. So ignore the fact that these are American shad. It's what I had handy when I threw this together. See this highlighted area here. Just imagine those are alewives and this is Long Island. They show up between February and May, depending on temperatures, and they'll actually come in waves. So in Connecticut, during healthy runs, we can see as many as 7 different of these waves, where we'll have fish come in on a high tide during the new moon, and then if we get a big rain event. But the idea is simple. These fish start coming in as the spring warms. They'll spawn. These fish are very prolific spawners. The large adults can have as many as 100,000 eggs. And they also have what's called iteroparity, so these fish can repeat spawn. So they're different from a Pacific salmon that will die after spawning. We've seen fish that have spawned as many as 5 times. And this is kind of hedging your bets. The further north you go, the more of these anadromous fish actually have that iteroparous life history. And the idea is that if they have a bad year, it's too cold, it's too warm, there's a drought, the next year when they come back, their offspring will be recruited. So once those eggs hatch, after about 3 to 6 days, depending on water temperatures, the juveniles will start rearing in the freshwater habitat. And then starting in June through November, these fish will emigrate back. The adults have long since left after spawning, but there's this constant trickle of juveniles going out into the estuary. So it's a constant food source. My previous supervisor used to always love to call these the mice of the sea. Everything wants to eat them, birds, other fish. We've had coyotes at our fishways taking fish out. We always see otters. When these things are around, you know it. All the birds of prey are around. It's wonderful. You know spring is here. And it continues through the whole season. Then these fish will transition out, and they'll spend 3 to 4 years at sea. We do get some very adventurous ones that come back at age 2, but for alewives, it's usually age 3, and for blueback herring, it's usually age 4. So it's kind of a small map, and I apologize for that, but you get the idea. These are obviously fish coming from the ocean. They're limited coastally and by larger rivers that cut through the state. And the problem that we have here is a problem you have as well, which are dams. It's kind of an old topic at this point, but for those of you who haven't come across this species before, obviously they need to get upstream to spawn. Now, they're incredible species because they survived the Industrial Revolution and all of this damming, and they can actually survive in elevated levels of seawater below tidal dams. We have places where these fish were not extirpated, even though a dam was built at the head of tide. But now we've built different kinds of fishways. Some of the dams that we have fishways over are as much as 60 feet tall. We've removed a lot of dams over the last 50 years in Connecticut. We've done a lot of work to really reconnect habitat for these fish, as well as you guys out here on Long Island. And again, as I said, alewives return at age 3, blueback at age 4, and this will be important later on. So how do we monitor these? Very similar to how it's done out here. We have electronic fish counts, which is basically like an easy pass system. Fish goes through and it counts it. We only use these on alewife runs because we don't want them in mixed stock. So if we have a big river, we can't utilize them because we'll accidentally count different species. In those systems, you can see on the bottom there, we have stills of video camera footage. Someone has to walk through and actually review all that footage and count all those fish. That's what seasonal help is great for. And then we also stock a lot of these fish. So very much like a salmon, they're imprinted on where they hatch. So we can actually take from healthy runs and move pre-spawn adults into those ponds. The majority of those fish will spawn. The juveniles that hatch there, that's now their home. Those adults will never come back. They'll go back to where we got them from the previous year. But the juveniles will now come back at age 3 and age 4. And we use this to restore runs. We've had great success. For instance, we've moved 200 fish to a lake, and 3 years later, 14,000 came back. So it works really, really well. The problem is, as I'm sure all of you have heard, there's a lot of problems with migratory fish. We know about dams. We know about pollution. Overfishing. All of these things come together to work against these fish. But an interesting thing is, as we've been working harder to reconnect this habitat, as waters have cleaned up, as in some places even predator base has gone down, we continue to struggle to bring these fish back. And we've had some mild successes, but as you can see in 2022, it's kind of tough on here, but just following that black line, you can see those peaks. Oftentimes those are around stocking events or reconnection of habitat, but then our success is immediately the wind's taken out of our sails, and we've been having a hard time trying to figure out what's going on here. And then in 2022, the floor just completely dropped out. And the majority of our runs statewide, including Rhode Island, and it sounds like some of them out here on Long Island, dropped below 10% of historic levels. Well, not historic levels, historic to the early 2000s, which were already greatly depleted. So that's the thing you're going to learn here is shifting baselines are a very important thing to remember. Again, Eastern Connecticut, the same thing. Our runs plummeted. And Bride Lake, which is actually one of our donors, it's our most important site in the state where we get all of our stock from. And we've had great successes there over the years. We had a big project with Save the Sound to restore connectivity, and we were averaging almost 400,000 fish a year there. And that dropped out, and this year we're only at 116,000, and the run is done there this year. So things are going very, very poorly, and we've been doing a lot of work with a lot of great partners. And this is the section that this is what got me into this. So this is the Thames River watershed, and this is in Eastern Connecticut. This is where I grew up. Now, I'm only 33 years old, and I watched these rivers go from silver in the spring to just water. The fish disappeared in my lifetime. This isn't us talking back, to the turn of the century. This is literally when I was a child. These runs were in the excess of tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands combined. And by the time I was in high school, I didn't see fish in these runs anymore. And this is after dam removal. This is after those rivers were cleaned up. This is after fishways were built. So something very clearly was going on there. Blueback herring, which I don't believe you have, at least not in your small coastal ponds. I know as you move down the island, I think there might be some mixing. But in Connecticut, I hate to say it, but they are basically functionally extinct. Last year, we passed less than 500 statewide. To give you an idea, in 1985, one of our fishways was over 600,000 fish. So 1985, those of you who are alive, I was not, but I'm sure you can say there were probably more dams. Water pollution was probably worse than it is now in some ways. Where did 500,000 fish go when we helped them? So this is what got me to revisit the bycatch issue. This issue came up in the 90s when this fishery started. It came up in the mid-2000s. It came up again in the 20-teens. It's often just been a very NGO-heavy look at this. And I've watched it. I've watched it as I've grown and I've been around this world. And I wanted to revisit it because I was like, if I can put the numbers to this and try and figure out a trend, we might actually be able to get somewhere with solving this problem. So again, this is Atlantic herring and Atlantic mackerel. And the Atlantic herring landings, this is historic from the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries. Jason didn't put out a great report. And just looking through and averaging, it's midwater trawl is about 70%. Makes up of the Atlantic herring landings. Bottom trawl, which is a small mesh near shore, was about 5%, and 25% is from a purse seine fishery in Maine. And we'll talk about that more in detail, and that obviously changes. Every year it's very different depending on who's fishing, where they're fishing, and what there is. The Atlantic mackerel fishery is a midwater trawl fishery. You can't really see it here, so I'm just going to be quick. There's basically management areas we're going to not talk about mackerel today. We're just going to focus on the Atlantic herring fishery because there's just not enough time. But there are these management areas, and within those management areas, they're allowed to take certain quotas of Atlantic herring that change every year. So just remember that as we go forward here. So what this is actually a bycatch avoidance program that was built by SMAST at UMass. And the whole idea behind this was really great. You work with the fishermen, you have observer coverage. If no one's on the boat, you do portside sampling, and you look and see where those boats were fishing, if there was high bycatch of river herring, because this is the idea. They're out there targeting Atlantic herring. You can't tell when you're looking on, say, a side scan sonar, the difference between an Atlantic herring and a river herring. So they accidentally catch these fish. It's always happened, and we know it happens. So this program was built to try and avoid that. And so this is midwater fishing, and you can see those red areas. It's just places where they had high interactions. They would make that report, and they would avoid those areas. Again, same idea, small mesh nearshore boats. They're much closer. They're not as far out as the bigger midwater trawls. But that being said, those midwater trawls also come in very tight to shore, as you can see in those photos back a ways on Rhode Island where they're right up against the rocks. So I'm going to spend the most time on this, and I know it's kind of hard to see, but you can see where I kind of highlight to the right here. What this is it's a figure I built last year trying to understand. I needed a fishway that had a long history. I wanted to see, well, what was going on? I know the 80s were really good. Well, what was going on before the 80s? And in Connecticut, we didn't start monitoring our fishways until 2002 when we put a full moratorium on river herring. We wanted to understand our success. So what I did was I worked with Ken Sprankle at U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and he was able to pull together the Holyoke numbers going back to the 1950s. And this is the Connecticut River, so it runs through Connecticut, but this is strictly looking at blueback herring passage through the Holyoke Dam. And you can see the bar graph there actually peaks, and it's over 600,000 fish. That's what I was talking about in 1985. But you can see, really oddly, beforehand, up until about 1977, there was essentially no river herring passage, and I was always told that's because the fishway didn't work. But oddly, a fishway that didn't work was passing up to 90,000 American shad. And I realize not a lot of you work with migratory fish, but American shad are incredibly hard to get to pass a fishway. They're very finicky, whereas river herring, you almost can't stop them if it's built in a way that shad can pass. So I was like, well, what could possibly have been going on? Many of you know that's when the EEZ was put in place through Magnuson-Stevens Act, and what that did was push off this very large non-domestic fleet of boats that was targeting mackerel and river herring. So it pushed them out. All of a sudden, they started to be restored. It is very convenient that 4 years later, we had almost 400,000 river herring coming back. And it doesn't necessarily mean that because these correlate, it's caused by that. I understand that. But it was a starting point for me to revisit this. Well, about 1991 to 1992, a domestic midwater trawl fleet started because we had an excess of herring. And it makes sense. You have a lot of something that people can use. A fishery starts, and it's managed for that fishery. Unfortunately, as many of you know, the Atlantic herring population has crashed through mismanagement. Interestingly, river herring are following the same trajectory because 4 or 5 years after the fishery started, we already closed the Connecticut River to blueback herring fishing for people like you and me, just residents wanting to go out and fish. So it was immediately a problem here, and this was brought, if you go into the history of this, it was brought forward by a lot of people. They were concerned that these boats were getting these fish. But there wasn't really a bycatch plan in place. But what there is there was incidental landings of blueback herring, and that's what that red line is. And you can see as the red line goes up, your bar graph, which is your past river herring passing your fishway, goes down. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean they're correlated, but I wanted to keep looking. So for me, I've got these landings data, but they're in metric tons. It tells us how many metric tons of blueback herring were landed in the 90s at the time that our river herring stopped passing. So I looked at some of these numbers, and 2,800 metric tons. It doesn't mean anything to me. I'm not in the seafood world. I deal with individual fish passing. So what I did was convert that over. David Bethany did some great work in the early 20-teens looking at this bycatch of river herring, and he got the length of those fish. So then we were able to take Ken Sprankle's data for blueback herring, and we were able to convert length to weight and then metric ton to grams, and found that it's about 10,000 blueback herring on average to a metric ton. So when you start looking, in 1996, when we had our largest drop, 28 million blueback herring were incidentally landed. Now when you figure we only passed 500, less than 500 last year, 28 million would probably help a little bit. Granted, that's coast-wide. but still it's a lot of fish. I can't even wrap my head around that. So then moving forward into the 2010s with a lot of pressure from states and NGOs, a catch cap was put in place on these fisheries. And again, we're just talking about the Atlantic herring fishery, but the Atlantic mackerel fishery has this as well. The whole idea is when those boats are out there fishing, to try and get them to avoid these locations, there is a catch cap in place. And that is if you hit that catch cap, now you're done fishing for your quota of Atlantic herring. It moves them off. So those areas that we talked about, if you hit it in, say, Area 3, now you can only fish in Area 2, 1A, and 1B. And you can see that, unfortunately, they do go over. So this is in Cape Cod. This is the Area 3. It goes, 201%. So it's double what was supposed to be taken. And these boats are big, and they work in, some of the midwater trawl boats are very large, and they can work paired together, and each boat's 450 metric tons. So two together, that's 900 metric tons potential. It's about 9 million potential herring. So two boats can move a lot of fish. And you can see here that it's probably why this happens. One big trip can take you way over. So again, we're looking at that yearly quota. If you combine the quota that's allowable, it's completely allowable, 361 metric tons, so 3.6 million river herring. Again, we're talking about the entire state of Connecticut last year combined. We had 173,000 river herring. So we could use those fish. Then a paper came out this fall, and they found, using DNA of that bycatch, that 56% of the alewife were coming from Block Island and Long Island Sound. So we are the ones right now with the least amount of returning alewives, and we are the ones whose fish end up the most in that bycatch. And so bringing that forward and looking, if you allow both those fisheries, that's 2.744 million potential if they take it, if they fill that quota. So the potential's there. So I was like, all right, well, let's see what they actually landed, because the quota has been dropping for Atlantic herring because the Atlantic herring fishery has been collapsing. But the catch cap quota, which is in blue, has actually gone up in this time. And I was trying to figure out, because to me that almost incentivizes not avoiding, because if your quota gets to a point where it's so low, for instance, in 2023, the catch cap quota for what was allowable as river herring was 22% of the actual Atlantic herring quota. So if I asked somebody, would you like a 22% increase on your income, you'd probably take it if it's completely legal. But for us, that hits us really hard because it's a lot of potential fish. So I wanted to look at what's actually been landed. So in 2018, just in the Atlantic herring fishery, you can't combine the two, because if you go on a herring trip and accidentally land mackerel, and now you're a mackerel trip as well, so your river herring catch cap goes against both of your fisheries. So you can't add the two together. It makes it look like you caught more than you actually did. So I just looked at Atlantic herring here. And so 234.5 metric tons in 2018. And this will make sense moving forward into now when we have less fish as a potential source here. And again, looking at that 2.345 million fish, if you assume these are all alewives, because as I said, we've essentially lost blueback herring in southern New England, that's the potential for 1.3 million alewife in 1 year. So again, the numbers are staggering when you look at what's actually passing. And so that Reed paper, which was much earlier than what I'm looking at, they estimated between 2012 and 2015 that combined this fishery took 4.6 million alewives and 1.2 million blueback herring. And again, when you think 56% of those alewives are from a very small area, the numbers, again, they're staggering. And so as we started moving into 2022 and our fish disappeared, I wanted to look at those catch caps. And I was like, okay, let's see what they're landing. And it's like, oh, they're really not landing anything. Like, maybe this isn't a problem. But then this year, the quotas shot back through the roof when observers got back on the boats. And that's the interesting thing about all this. There weren't observers from 2019 to 2022, essentially. This is from the New England Fisheries Management Council, and you can see right there, Southern New England bottom trawl, Southern New England midwater trawl, they're zeroed out. So it's really hard to report landings if there's no one to record the landings. And this is the data gap that I'm concerned about. Our fish have disappeared in a time when we don't know what happened at sea, and we didn't experience a drought in 2019. We had good water quality. The fish got out. They went to sea. We know they went to sea. They didn't come back, and there's no data for bycatch available for us. So again, this is what I said. We won't touch on that again. But so there was a buffer zone put in place for 1 year. Unfortunately, it got thrown out in court. So that buffer zone would have moved those larger midwater trawl boats 12 miles offshore. That got thrown out. So we really didn't get to see what would come of that. But it's interesting, and I found this really bizarre because historically blueback herring showed up in the midwater trawl fleets more than the nearshore fleets. And what we found was that looking at nearshore small mesh fishery, it was historically alewives. But as these bigger fish have now moved inshore, they're not fishing off Georges anymore. They're fishing closer to shore, and it's our alewives that are now disappearing. And historically, we were losing bluebacks much faster in the 90s, but now we're losing alewives, and they're saying, hey, if you shut us out of those nearshore waters, you're going to put us out of business because that's where the majority of our fish come from. So it concerns me that now what we're seeing in the alewives is going to be what we saw in the blueback herring in the 90s. So for anybody who wants to know what happens where this fishery isn't allowed inshore, in Maine, uniquely in 2007, the Gulf of Maine, so all the way down to the tip of Cape Cod, there's actually a closure in place until June. So no herring fishing is allowed. Atlantic herring fishery is allowed. So when the river herring are coming in to spawn, those boats aren't active. And then starting in June, no midwater trawl fishing is allowed in October. So those big boats aren't allowed there until October. And interestingly, the purse seine fishery, because the quota is so low now, usually gets the majority of those landings. So they're essentially absent from that fishery. And when you look at the river herring shad catch caps, on average, 3.2% of it comes from that area. The majority is coming from here, where our fish are. And that's been shown genetically, too. And in Maine, record years. Last year when I talked to the biologists up there, they said it looks like the 80s again. They're blown away by how many river herring they have, and it's only been going up since 2007. There's obviously some fluctuations during drought years and other things, and we know that. But overall, they're doing much better. So what are these data gaps that I'm talking about? This is where I'm going to leave you guys, because I really want to make people think. I want people to question it. I want people to go through and read the literature. I'm not saying that, river herring are death by 1,000 cuts. We know that. But this is one incredibly large gash that these fish can't handle right now. So what I would like to see is we need observers moving forward. NOAA canceled funding for the observer program. So right now, observer coverage moving forward is going to be less than 6%, and that's where it's been. When it's been in place good years, we're lucky if we get 5 or 6% observer coverage on these boats. So we have very little data. I don't even want people on the boats, just portside sample. It's much cheaper. The states did it for the SMAST program, and during the SMAST program, our alewife numbers went up, and they went up considerably. That program seemed to work, but that program's not in place anymore because they lost funding, and when the buffer zone was put in place, they said, we don't need to do that anymore. The buffer is going to protect these fish. But it got thrown out, and there's no program anymore. The other thing I think we should have is an avoidance program, like I was just talking about for the SMAST program. And we need to update that DNA data set. The DNA data set shows that from 2012 to 2015, the majority of the bycatch was from southern New England, but we don't know what it is right now. It could be worse. It might not be. We also need to reduce those river herring and shad catch caps to reflect those Atlantic herring stocks. You can't have 22% of your quota be your bycatch. It incentivizes not fishing clean. If anybody has any questions, please reach out. Like I said, I just want this to kind of get the wheels turning in people's heads again, bring this back to the forefront. This isn't me saying we shouldn't fish. It's me saying we should figure out how to work with these guys and fish clean to avoid these fish. And we can't do that if nobody's on those boats. Thank you. Do we have time for questions? Oh, wonderful. I thought I was going to go over. Thank you. Yeah, and interestingly enough, in Maine, they have a very successful program harvesting river herring. The idea is they don't take them at sea. They take them at the specific place that those fish are going to spawn. So each lake or river actually has an escapement goal. So they have to reach their escapement goal, which it fills the lake before they can start harvesting. So it's actually incredibly sustainable. And again, they have those at-sea protections. So I commend Maine. They have an awesome program, and they harvest millions of river herring every year for lobster bait and have record returns.
So, thank you, Kevin. Can you tell us what can we do to help address the issue of bycatch? What would be the approach that you would recommend? Because I think that's what we're facing here, so I want some guidance on that, and maybe all of us can actually help somehow.
Yeah, the thing that I've started doing is just attending more of the New England Fisheries Management Council meetings. And again, if you're looking at the mackerel fishery, which has a very similar problem, this year they're at like 107 metric tons already. They will get shut down this year, I'm sure, for bycatch, and they have a very low quota as well. But attending those meetings, just going on those websites and trying to understand the process of how these fisheries are managed, because that's what I had to do. I didn't know that. This stuff isn't taught to us in school, and it's not taught to us in the field. When you come on as a biologist, no one talks about where your fish could be disappearing other than where you're working. So we know dams are an issue, and we know pollution's an issue. We know all these things that go on inland, but the things at sea, it's never really brought to us. And the whole policy, it's all politics, and it's incredibly complicated to learn. But once you start going to those meetings and reading the meeting minutes, it starts to make more sense. I think that's the biggest thing we can do, like I'm doing still. I'm still informing myself on this and trying to ask those questions to understand it, because it's not a fun topic to broach, and people don't want to. It makes people very uncomfortable when you bring this up at a management council meeting, because you look at when quotas for Atlantic herring were 50,000 metric tons, and bycatch was much lower than it is now when it's 4,000 metric tons, which kind of makes it sound like if your quota is very low because your target species is very infrequent, you're going to increase your bycatch when your bycatch looks exactly the same. But your catch cap quota is so high, it's not set on any biological basis. Again, I'm not saying they're targeting river herring. I'm just saying it's very hard not to accidentally take these. And the catch cap landings are so high right now that it's okay to take those until you're shut down. I think there was another question here.
It looks like the fish recover really quickly.
They do.
How do they do this reproduction?
So I'm going to do it, Mariah. I'm going to bring in the cockroaches. So I'd like to call these the prettiest silver cockroaches of the sea, because if you think about these fish, imagine you have a house full of cockroaches and you close off every room and kill all the cockroaches but one room, the cockroaches still thrive. So imagine that's the fish below one dam. If you remove a dam, it's like removing a door to another room. They're going to thrive into that new place because they're incredibly prolific spawners. They're very short-lived. So if you can go through and do that and remove all those dams and your fish aren't coming back, it's clearly not a habitat issue if you had them there in 1985 in huge numbers when your river was still semi-polluted and you didn't have any passage. If you were able to stop the bycatch and, these fish can deal with droughts. Actually, one of our best returns ever was 3 years after one of our worst droughts, which goes against everything we know about these fish. So somehow they have evolved to deal with drought in an incredible way. Those fish got out early enough before the river dried up, or they stayed in the lake and got out in the winter when it started raining again. So that's the idea. They just need a chance. If you give these things a chance, they really are kind of like cockroaches. They come back really, really fast. We had a run in Maine of 1,000 fish. It's 3.7 million. It's been 9 years. That's just 9 years of those fish coming back. It's incredible how fast it happens. And that's what that figure showed of the Connecticut River. Thank you. Appreciate it.